You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
This week's episode of From Embers brings you a conversation with Anne Hansen, who served 7 years of a life sentence in federal prisons. She's a prison abolition activist and author of Direct Action, Memoirs of an Urban Guerrilla, and recently published a book about her experiences in prison called Taking the Rap, Women Doing Time for Society's Crimes, and that was published by Between the Lines in Toronto. Taking the Rap goes back and forth between personal stories of Anne's experiences in women's prison in Canada and critical accounts of conditions and transformations in the Canadian prison system from the 1980s through to the 2000s. It especially highlights the repression faced by Native women in prison and a few different ways that the Correctional Services of Canada have tried to put some fancy new window dressings on the same old institution of colonization and control. I think Anne's commitment to telling true stories, combined with her revolutionary perspective and deep understanding, have created a powerful book, and I highly recommend it. Thanks for talking to me.
Oh, well, thanks for interviewing me. I'm honored.
Thanks. Can you tell me a bit about why you decided to write the book in the first place?
I think, actually, to be honest, as soon as I went to prison, I was aware that I would, I don't know, I didn't have any vision of what kind of book, but I knew that I would want to have a record of things, because throughout my entire time in prison, even like those short suspensions, I would write, I would never write like about things that would be a security problem if the guards got a hold of it, right? But I would write about things that I thought were important to put down that I might forget, or really interesting stories or events. Now, a lot of stuff sort of disappeared, like who knows, I'd throw out papers or whatever. But I did keep a lot of documents or journals or whatever you want to call it, because I knew that it was, a unique experience and one that I would want to share with other people, especially because of my history. As a political activist, I figured other people would end up going to jail, and it would be valuable information, for people. I have always enjoyed reading books about prison, or about just different, life experiences that I haven't had but could have, just to kind of get a heads up on what's going to happen.
For sure, I think those stories are super valuable and important to share. For people who might not be familiar with your story, do you want to quickly talk about how you got to prison?
Sure. Yeah, so back in the early 80s, there was relative, about maybe fewer than today, but there were anarchists and feminists and, Indigenous activists all over Canada. And there was a group of us who, independently at different ends of the country, we're thinking about escalating our political activism to more like urban guerrilla style stuff. It was more prevalent in those days, like, back in the 60s and 70s, the whole notion of urban guerrilla warfare was very common, mainly because it had come from the history of the national liberation movements in Africa and South America. And so sort of, white people in North America and in Europe were engaging in it. And so we decided too that, we were inspired by people in both Africa, South America, but in particular other white people who were like us, who weren't opposed to political activism on a legal level, but we felt that it was important that there also be a more militant political activism. So we started this group. We spent a few years sort of called Direct Action, and it was kind of a combination of anarchists and, anarchism, feminism. We'd been involved in prison abolition work, and we were very supportive of the Indigenous struggles that were going on. And we spent a couple of years kind of honing our analysis, and so we could figure out what our most effective actions could be, and learning skills, urban guerrilla skills, which would be more like your typical criminal skills, Mm-hmm. And so we went on this campaign, did some actions. I won't get into everything. And then we got caught and convicted, and we all ended up going to prison for a while. This was pre-9/11, so we all got out in a actually relatively short period of time compared to probably today.
When I started reading your book, I realized it picked up right where the last one left off with court and sentencing, and I found that really interesting, because I always find that interesting, the way that people navigate a bad situation together and make decisions. Can you tell me a bit more about that process?
Well, I think before we got arrested, we did spend quite a bit of time really laughing hysterically about what would happen if we got busted going over the criminal code, at night. And we were always, we had a pretty good sense of humor about things, but we did have serious talks about if we ever got busted. And of course, we were very idealistic, so we all envisioned, that we would refuse to participate, that we would declare ourselves political prisoners. And plus, there were these guys, Dino and Gary Butler, who'd been busted in a shootout in Vancouver before we even went underground, and they were living in the same house as like myself. Their spouses were, because I lived in this women's house, so the Indigenous women were there, and their support group for the Butlers, and they were like, Dino Butler and the two Butlers. They were part of the American Indian movement. I think Dino had been at Pine Ridge at that time. So they were really hardcore. And John Trudell was there a lot. So we were very inspired by them. And they had, they were not allowed to use their spiritual Indigenous items in court, so they refused to participate, and, they were shackled and dragged in or else left out of the courtroom entirely. But then when it came right down to it, it wasn't that we were scared. It was more that it was when the reality hits you, in our particular case, there were so many factors. Like, for example, they didn't have hardly anything on Doug, and we were all being tried together. So what were we going to do? Take this super hardcore stance, refuse to participate, and then Doug would get 20 years, when meanwhile, he'd probably only get 5 or 6 years for the amount of evidence they had on him, right? So you get into all these things where, do you really, like, if, for instance, if I got charged with killing a cop, right? I would probably immediately become super, like, I'm not participating, because you know you're going to go down, right? And you know you're not going to get out for 25 years. There's no way that's happening. Yeah. And I'm not trying to downplay people's decisions to not participate, because the Butlers, for example, weren't facing that series of charge. But when you have a lot of different people involved and you're all in the same, you're all being tried together, and everyone's kind of got a different perspective. That I guess that's why we went through some of the trials. We went through one trial because, for instance, Doug was not even involved the first trial was a Brinks conspiracy robbery charge, which he was really not involved in, but he was charged with us. So we decided to go through the trial, and yes, he did get acquitted on that. Anyways, so it was like I said in that book, it was kind of like I made like a little analogy to 5 people walking across like a canyon on a tightrope, and so you somehow got to really orchestrate the way you walk and step to prevent, one person from falling off and whatever. So we all had slightly different trial strategies. It wasn't, and then there's all these other people involved, like we're in prison and we have our friends that have there's a defense support group and then just a support group, and people are sort of fighting about different things out there. Like that happens. Mm-hmm. And there were people who wanted to really use this publicity of that we wanted a fair trial, which is kind of bourgeois really, based on, assuming that we do have civil rights. And in retrospect, I thought that was really, kind of not a good trial strategy. But at any rate, so it wasn't this pure, idealistic trial strategy. But I think it was the best for all the different circumstances we had to deal with. I think that's what happens in general, and especially when you're, you have these ideals, and when you actually are in the real situation, it's always way more messy than what you dreamed of to begin with, right?
That leads me to thinking about your description of your political identity in prison, and I think I remember you describing a few times in the book that you had sort of lost your political identity. Do you think that's true, or would you?
Well, I wouldn't say I lost it ever, but I think what happened, you get isolated from the outside political community, and even if I always had a lot of visitors, but even then, like my real daily life was in the prison. That's what was actually having the most impact on my identity. And I never lost my political identity, but what happens is there weren't that many people who were interested in organizing like the sort of resistance in prison that you sort of would normally, that you might envision, I mean, there was resistance, but it was more informal, and it just, I don't know. I don't really know why. I mean, I wrote letters to people, and we did do tried to get public interest in certain things, like people being in segregation for too long. But I mean, even Gail Horry, when she went on her hunger strike, complained when she wanted to be transferred about how hard she had tried, and she was our inmate chairperson, was really, spent a lot of time trying to get outside community support to support getting people out of segregation who were in there for years, but it was very discouraging. So I don't know. I think when I look back on it, I probably could have done more in terms of trying to organize the other women, but you're really not. The women in prison are just like you would. They're very strong people as a rule, probably stronger than most because of all the things they've been through. So the notion of going in there and organizing the women, kind of influencing them, and this sort of vision that I'm in some way superior to them, so I'm going to go in there and organize them, is a false one, really. Yeah. The women in there are very, very acute, very, very sensitive to stuff like that too. And they would just go, what the fuck? What are you, trying to be a blowhard? Like, there'd be stuff like that would come out of people's lips. I tried to portray some of the things, like when me and Julie got into Ocala, we were on 10 out of 10, like political activism, right? We were on the top level of that's what we're going to do. And when we did this stupid hot dog, we kicked over our lunch tray because they dragged one of the women off to transfer to P4W. And I'll never forget how the women in there just thought it was ludicrous. And in a way it was. We were like destroying our own lunch. But they were like, they're a little cynical too, right? Sure. Like, what do you think they're going to do? Bring her back? Just because, so these are not people who are just sitting there waiting to be liberated. Like, there is a bit of a false image, I think. That is something I've been sort of becoming more and more aware of. I'm not talking about like the anarchist community, actually. I'm thinking more about a lot of, there is a danger of people who mean well to have this image of people in prison needing help. Like they're victims, right? And so that has a connotation of defenselessness, weakness, and the person who's going to help them is obviously more competent, has more power, knows what to do. It's like the victim is this poor, helpless thing, and the person who's going to help them is more intelligent, organized, and perhaps that's true in the cases of like people having perhaps more education, white privileged people, right? But my experience with the women in prison was there's many different kinds of people in there, but there's a hell of a lot of very strong-minded women who are sort of hyper aware, like spidey senses for people who are going to try to manipulate them, use them, tell them what to do, because they experience that all the time with the cops, social workers. So many women in prison have been in juvenile detention centers, foster homes. They've been, indoctrinated with authoritarian figures. So they are the most sensitive people to having people tell them what to do. And I did find that almost intuitively, I sensed that as time went on. It's not that I wouldn't want to be with a group of women in prison who organized a constant series of acts of resistance, but in just the experience I had was that the women did resist, but it wasn't always that simple either, Mm-hmm. There's a huge consequences too to resistance. And then there are women who are very mentally unstable or, like, for instance, even if we had a conscientious lockdown, like we just refused to work, you could count on, after a few days, women slashing in their cells who were just couldn't take it any longer, or stringing up or stuff like that. And that's a lot of, I'm not giving excuses. I'm explaining why I didn't go in there and, start really like following through on some sort of classic organizing campaign.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And those consequences are pretty heavy. Did you end up organizing with women that had been in prison later, or I think?
Yeah, when I got out, there was a group of women. And again, it wasn't me that started it, I wouldn't say. Like, it's really quite, people might think, oh, I did, but I didn't. Women for Justice, we started that. A group of us, there was a group of us from Kingston here who'd been in prison together, and then we were in the halfway house together, and then we were all sort of like kept in touch. And we did do quite a bit of, it was more like awareness raising. We had film nights, and we did do stuff on Prisoners Justice Day. We actually did, we made a little film, but that was a film professor at Queen's who got a grant, and we made a little film about our experiences. But we did meet regularly, and we had this plan at the time that we wanted to buy a place and have it as a transition house that would be run by ex-prisoners, right? Mm-hmm. And the board of directors would have to have, the majority of people would have to be women who've been in prison. It wasn't like we couldn't have anybody, but all the employees and the majority of people, of directors would be. We even got a grant from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Association because EFRI did back up the plan. Although when I think back on if we ever had bought that house, they would have probably somehow ended up owning it in the long run. But so we got a grant. We wrote up a business plan, and they were really quite impressed with the idea. But then we got to a phase where we would have had to have raised all the money to get a down payment for a house.
Right.
Like about probably, who knows, well over 100,000, right, to buy a house for women to live in, not a halfway house, a transition house. And just the way things are, we all had various issues, like either slight problems, drug addiction, or people were involved with just life took us. It was just, that was about as far as we got. Mm-hmm. And I know in my own life, I also had to make a decision because people were kind of dropping out, and I realized that we reached a point where it would be like a full-time thing. You couldn't just sort of sit down for an evening a week to raise 100,000. And actually, what if we got this house? Yeah. We were going to have a cafe like the Goat on the main floor and apartments upstairs. It would take a few people being extremely dedicated to make it work.
You're listening to From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM. And this is Andre Petipas with Target Market.
Descends below the city skyline. My cell blows up because it's prime time and I need switch for my splash, pushing dough for the man as the confusion goes on, all according to plan. It makes you wonder why so many tax dollars are wasted when the law creates a market for Capones and scar faces. The shame is that every year nothing ever changes as they pluck us off the street and throw us off into cages. Cause we are the target market. This ain't a war on drugs, but a means of control. Creating conditions of filthy sights to behold. Feeding my tummy off Joe the Fiend and Freddy the Junkie. Or the kids in the suburbs stealing money from their mummies. While the lawyers get paid more than most of us. Not to mention the judges and guards and cops who bust down doors to fill up the jail some more. Is this criminal justice or a retirement score? They put you down on the floor and put your hands where they can see them. They don't mind using force, in fact they're looking for a reason. While the system leaves you feeling like there's no alternative. And once again the wolf gets blamed for just trying to live. I know you heard it on the radio. I know you saw it on the video. Welcome to the freak show. But there is something you should know. They got you lined up like ducks in a row between a razor wire wall and an electrified fence. It's counterintelligence. It's counterintelligence. And it's directed at you. Cause you are the target market. Target market. intelligence, and it's directed at you, cause you are the target. Market. Target. Market. Why would a corporation want to own a penal institution? I think conscription labor is the only explanation. I developed this opinion and came to this conclusion. While living as a member of a prison population, now I'm free, but the street's getting sketchy again. And good old Sergeant Brown is trying to catch me again. But I would never be a slave. I'll take the grave, my friends, rather than $12 a day inside a privatized pen. Yo, tell them already, Wappy, tell them again. Tell them already, Wappy, tell them again, get. Cause we are the target. Market. Target. Market.
Going back to the book, did you struggle with the decision to write about certain things, or were there things that you had difficulty figuring out how to include?
Yeah, I mean, to this day, you know, I have given this book to people who I wrote about. Like Norma, in the end, is a real person, and I sent it to her. I didn't know, I tried to find her mother, because I knew her, we weren't like super close, but I would say we were friends. So I found her lawyer and I sent her a copy of the manuscript, and then I asked her to send it to her mother to read it first, and if she thought it was, because the big problem I had was, even though I'd changed the names and, you know, a little bit of the physical descriptions, it's just like myself. I couldn't romanticize people and make them out to be these really perfect people, right? If I'm writing a true story, like myself, that's why I couldn't say, oh, you know, I'm this heroic revolutionary that went in there and, you know, organized the women, although it would be so much bullshit that people would expose me. But, you know, and it was the same, and I have lots of flaws. And so when I wrote about people, you know, I tried, the first draft would be completely unedited, right? And then I'd reread it the next time, thinking about the person reading it, and I go, oh my God, I can't say that, you know, delete things. But even the finished product, there's things that I kind of cringe about, because I just, you know, like I haven't had any bad feedback, but I might, you know.
I guess that's a intense thing about writing a memoir too, is that people in your life will read the book, and yeah, I could see it being hard for people to have those conversations even if they wanted to or reacted in some way to the book.
Yeah. Like I sometimes wonder if how many people have even really read it, because I have given it to quite a few people. I don't know how many have actually read it, you know. But yeah. That's just for the record, I'll put this out there. This is the last memoir I write, because 2 is plenty, you know.
I appreciated that you put in a lot of information about also what CSC was doing throughout those years and the effects of their different policy and administrative decisions and actions of the guards and whatever on people's lives?
I think I'm addressing this because I just feel like I have to say this because, one of the main things I did not want to do was have this ideological decision and take real life stories and manipulate them to be like a parable, an anarchist parable. It would have been ridiculous. And unfortunately, you know yourself, life is not this little, parable or perfect little like sort of stories, like I'm sure within the anarchist community, there are people who are complete assholes, right? And yet there's people that are really great too. And sometimes when groups are working together, it doesn't work out as non-hierarchical as what we would want. And in prison, I just wanted to I set out to write. I just sort of thought, Claude would sort of think, okay, that's a good story. And I would write it, and I'd try really hard not to write it with an analysis in mind. I'd try to write it like things really happened, and was hoping that when I was finished, that there would be wisdom or truth that would come out of just real stories in which people are not stereotypes, either the guards or the prisoners. Because there were times when a guard would be really compassionate, and it would be weird. Like, people don't always fit these, and then it's almost disappointing because you can't really... Mind you, the bottom line is, like with guards, if they have a direct order to do something, they got to do it. So it doesn't matter how nice or compassionate they are, they ultimately are going to do the bidding of the CSC, or they're going to be out the door, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about relationships between the women, both, I guess, your personal experience of that, but also how much that was an important factor in people's lives or in the social reality of prison?
Yeah, well, I think that the relationships between the women, both, romantic or sexual and not romantic and sexual, were the most important thing in prison because, you really did have no freedom, and there was this constant, conflict going on between the prisoners and the staff, the prison regime. So the intensity of the relationships was so much, it felt so much like 10 times more than on the outside. Because you can imagine, like if especially like I was not in GVI for any length of time, but in P4W, it's just, this is a bit of a sidebar, but this woman, I think I mentioned that before, but I met her in the halfway house, and she was in she was in P4W, and then she was in GVI, and now she's in the halfway house, and we met for coffee, and we were both reminiscing really fondly of P4W, and we were laughing about how ridiculous it was, but compared to GVI, it was really not bad. Mm-hmm. And we were reminiscing fondly because, you have this group of women, like 50 on our range, who are, most of them there for years, living right beside each other. It's like living in little tiny apartments with these bars in front. And most people do develop relationships, like, sexual, intimate relationships with another woman. Even, like, surprisingly, everybody, not everybody, but the vast majority of women do. I've seen women come in there who are, older women. At the time when I was there, I would have thought older would be like 50 or 40. Let's say 50 to be more realistic. Somebody who would go to church every Sunday, like mass in the prison, and pretty straight. Maybe they were in there for being a drug mule. And maybe after a year, all of a sudden you'd see the same woman. You'd go down to the gym and she'd be there with another woman just playing volleyball and laughing, and you could just tell that they were in love, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just sort of a natural thing that happens when you're in an environment like that, where you're really close. That's where you get your sustenance for living is from the other women. And you're also in this really intense environment where, there's so many extreme repercussions. It's not like a war, because that is a false equivalency. That would be way more extreme. But there is certain similarities, right? So, and in P4W, again, I don't want it to be interpreted that I thought it was really great, because I actually didn't think it was really great. But, lesbianism was pretty much accepted by the administration. Nobody that I can recall was ever charged for having like for example, we all had shams, they called them. They were like they weren't see-through, but they weren't sheer, but you couldn't see through them. Yeah. And the guards could move them like this because the cells were always unlocked all day. But it was pretty much unheard of for a guard to just walk up and open the shams. Like if the shams are shut, they go, "Ann, are you in there?" And I mean, it's pretty routine that if you were having sex with somebody and you said, "Yeah, I am, but I'm busy," that they may say, "Well, we got to see a bit of you," and then you maybe stick your feet out or something, right? Yeah. But the guards, and there were a fair number, I would guess, of lesbian guards as well. I imagine maybe sometimes gay women are attracted to that job. I don't know, working with just women. So I have to say that I'm trying to think here that I'm not sort of romanticizing it, but I think it was a fairly gay-friendly environment, really, in my memories. And I don't remember women being separated either because they were causing trouble for the administration. Like pretty much people were in the same area. But when I went to GVI, which was in the 2000s there, by 2012, a huge percent, let's say 20% of the population would be double bunked. Even in the maximum security unit, I was double bunked twice, and I was only there for a couple of months. So that really causes trouble for having relationships. And you could have a relationship. When I was in there in 2006, I was in the compound, and lots of women were involved, just like in P4W, especially long-term prisoners. There were way more short-term ones there, though, by that time, just probably because of the increase in the minimum sentencing laws and stuff. But as time went on, they were beginning to, by 2012, they were really conscientiously using relationships to control people. Like if a couple were clearly political and protesting things that were going on in the prison, then they could very easily separate them. Like, for example, move one woman into another. We call them bungalows in 2006. It's representative of how things deteriorated. By 2012, they were units. All the women call them units. Just like now people call the women that work in the halfway house guards. And I have to admit, we didn't call them guards. We just called them by their names because things had just gotten worse. That's all there is to it. And maybe people have become more politicized. But the higher the security and the more repressive the prison, I'd say, the harder it is for women to have relationships. It's reflected in that. Like in the max unit, I mean, it was out and out illegal. Not just to have a relationship, but to touch someone. Physical contact was absolutely illegal in the max unit. It was just ludicrous. I mean, the first time I realized it was with my friend Norma, and I remember she was a little bit overweight, so she had a little bit of trouble putting her nail polish on her toes. So she put her toes on me, and I was putting nail polish on them. It was clearly an innocent thing. Boom! Like they have intercom, two-way intercoms. They start, "Get your feet off her, there's no physical contact." And then I started asking her about it, and apparently you couldn't even, if you were playing around and pushing each other or just you couldn't comb each other's hair. There was no contact allowed. But women always find a way. So everybody knew that if you did, there were, and that was another thing. You couldn't really have a relationship in the max unit because they would 100% put you in another pod, separate you, and there's no contact between pods. Except, I used to visit a friend up in the library, and that would be for 20 minutes. Not even yard time, nothing. So, but if you were the kind of person who was into quick sexual experiences, everybody knew that you could open 2 cell doors and go into the cell, and you'd have to be pretty quick. Yeah. So really intimate, close relationships that were sexual in nature were there was no pussyfooting around. Like this, the administration did not try to hide the fact that they would not allow women to have sexual relationships in the maximum security unit, which should be illegal, really, for them to outlaw it. That was one of the positive things about prison, I must say, those the relationships between the women. Because I know in my life I've never had as close a relationship to other women as I did in prison. Yeah.
Did you find it hard to write about, like, your relationship with, I think you called her Sammy?
Yeah, because it was kind of difficult because she's dead. So I did often think, is this kind of bad, like, to write about someone who's dead? But at the same time, I guess I felt like I don't think she would have really been upset about anything that I said in there. But yeah. And, it was difficult too because just like me, I mean, neither one of us were these perfect people. We had our flaws. But I hope I didn't misrepresent her,
My baby want me at the game, but I tell her this is all that I know. I could've took her 9 to 5, but the hustle life is what I chose. My team need me on the streets, but my fam want me on the right road. And that the pressure building up got me feeling like I'm about to explode.
Out here, it don't feel like work. I'm a ODB, the new dirt McGirt. I've been at it so long, my skin's like leather. From the cold, my bones and heart aches together. I'm a soldier, I represent that 2%. Every tattoo on my body proves who I am. I'm a Winnipeg boy, that's who I am. And my name more feared than the ghost of Saddam. I'm a monster, a Pack City vet. And the Goonies, they soldiers, they ain't cadets. Go and put them to the test, see you breathe the last breath. We the last man standing and the last one's left. The streets is dangerous, life gets cold in the snow. I told myself no more, but I can't let go. These streets is all that I know, the streets is all that I owe. And if this rap don't work, player, guess where I'll go.
My baby want me at the game, but I tell her this is all that I know. I could've took her 9 to 5, but the hustle life is what I chose. My team need me on the streets, but my fam want me on the right road. And that the pressure building up got me feeling like I'm about to explode. Every time I leave my house, my girl say that she worry. She say she plagued by dreams of my casket being buried. But I'm moving fast through the flurry, money coming in a hurry. Plus I drink and smoke till my vision going blurry. Game got a funny way of pulling me back. Try to stay on the right side by making these tracks. Get away from the bad life. But I'm addicted to the fast life, I gotta get stacks. I got this stress on my mind, I can't even go to sleep. Paranoid of the boys in blue, they stay up on the creek. So even though I'm free, I can't run wild on the street. Cause I'm living on parole, my P.O. is holding the leash. I'm just trying to get my money, have my family living right. Make it through the dark till it's sunny and walk into the light. It'll probably never happen, but we doing alright. How you want me to lead the game, baby? This is my life. My baby want me at the game, but I tell her this is all that I know. I could've took her 9 to 5, but the hustle life is what I chose. My team need me on the streets, but my fam want me on the right road. And that the pressure building up got me feeling like I'm about to explode.
It's been a long time coming, it's been a long time running in the ghetto, and I love it. This money making is nothing. My family is who I'm trusting, and nothing comes over hustling. Comes out when Brooklyn start busting. I played it hard, and the puzzle was puzzling, and I was back to the bone. And I grew up with the monkeys, and mama used to trip trip out about how much money kept coming. I had to watch my back as my money kept doubling. And it was fast like young Cuddies, nothing but clubbing. And it was 5-star hotels with the jacuzzi bubbling. And rather than lie, my people knew I was thugging. And rather than hate it, my mama, she learned to love
My
it.
baby want me at the game, but I tell her this is all that I know.
All that I know.
I could've took a 9 to 5, but the hustle life is what I chose.
What I chose.
My team need me on the streets, but my fam want me on the right road.
On the right road.
And that the pressure building up got me feeling like I'm about to explode.
Like I'm about to explode.
And that was Winnipeg's Most with All That I Know. Are you expecting blowback from CSC for writing about some of the things that paint them in a negative light in the book? Like, I love the story about the Jane Fonda workout tapes.
That is true. That is
Yeah.
true. Like, everybody, I mean, I know people here in Kingston that could tell you. Like, it's just a true story. And I've given it to my parole officer. Apparently, she gave it to regional, and apparently they sent it to, apparently the headquarters, CHC headquarters in Ottawa, any prisoner or parolee that writes a book, or if they're on parole, have to give them a copy to read. And I've had no feedback, so no comment. So, but that's the thing. They probably know it's true. Like the actual facts are that photo was found. It's everybody knew about it at the time, like all the prisoners. Mm-hmm. And there's only one person he could have belonged to. But I like that because of the way it is true. Like, the women are not these sort of victims. You know what I mean? Like, instead of being absolutely horrified, it was like funny, and then they used it to their own, like, you know, their own advantage, right?
Yeah.
But it was always considered. It's funny how women in prison do. I'm making big generalizations. A lot of things, like, there really was. If there was a man working with women, they were having sex with prisoners in one way or another. I left out huge stories about men, guards or workers, who had ongoing relationships, like Mark's, for the women, right? I don't know, the women were usually in control of it. I mean, it's not right, but it's a weird topic, you know. I've heard in the past that there was a guard who would go into SEG and was very physically abusive sexually, and he lost his job. But in a lot of cases, when men, guards, or staff have been involved with the women, it's true, it's a big power imbalance, like a priest and an altar boy. But there's a lot of gray area there, because usually the women got something out of it.
Yeah.
Like cigarettes or booze or...
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't condemn those women for making the most of their situation at all, even if I would think that the guard or staff in that position or something was, in fact, doing something unethical. Like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like everything, right? It's complicated because, you know, there are cases, I'm sure, where a guard would be really abusing a woman, let's say, and she couldn't do anything because he could put her in SAG or take away her privileges. But in a lot of cases, the women would be quite complicit in it. Like, they weren't uptight about it, and were getting something out of it. That's just the ones that I knew of. You know, like, so there may have been a little bit of sex going on, but the women quite often got something for it, and would have been pissed off if other prisoners had fucked it up for them.
Yeah, no doubt.
They wouldn't want you to, like, it would have been ratting out, right?
Yeah.
But usually it became very obvious, like the one story there, which became like, it was on the news and everything. Oh, wow. That guard was outrageous. I don't know if you remember that story. I mean, it was on CBC about It was a guard at GVI who was having sex with this woman, and he got caught. And his wife worked in the building, in the administration. She was an administrator. So once everybody knew about it, everybody figured, including the prisoners and the administration, that would be the end of it. But no, it wasn't. Then he managed to make her. She had a private family visit, and he met up with her in the private family visiting unit, and it was a setup, like, I don't know, not by the woman or the guard, but by the staff, and they busted him again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And prison still tried to keep it under wraps, but I think E. Fry had called the press, and a couple of and prisoners had too, actually. But it was kind of typical, a typical sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Did you have any final thoughts about the book or, those stories from P4W or GVI? Or any parting words?
Well, just that the prison system is not getting any better. That's one thing. So I do think that whether I would not put any store on, like, whenever there's been reforms, there may be a period where you have reforms, like at P4W. There was a period in the 70s, makes sense, right? The 60s and 70s, where they put an extension on, and they had to put in a wood shop and sewing, industrial sewing area, and an ADP. This is pre-computers, automatic data processing, where they had early computers, and they had all these reforms implemented. They put in the military barracks, which became the minimum security area, a family visiting house. Now, all these things are great, right? They actually made life pretty good. But it took a long time. But now, even myself, the last time I was at GVI, that's all gone now. P4W is closed. And what exists now is way worse. And everybody will tell you that. Like, there's no woodworking department. There's only Corcan type jobs. Very few. Like, they used to have a lot of women worked in the cafeteria, and they liked it. Because really all the women, there could be a large staff of women prisoners working together, making food, and one cook who was really a cool guy. He was actually, everybody loved him. Really, really, he was actually a good staff person, right? Yeah. And really, it would have been better if they were going to make any changes, would have been probably to set up, instead of building all these new prisons, would have been to have put more improvements into P4W, maybe given families money to travel and visit. Because, the visiting situation hasn't improved. So that's all, I guess. That's my conclusion, that prisons have not gotten any better. And that you can't really, you know what? I think if people feel critical about prisoners not resisting more, people should take a look out here and go, well, we have so much more freedom. And if we're not creating this really big resistance movement, how can we expect people in prison who have so much more severe repercussions, surveillance, and everything else to organize against what's going on in there? Because it is really way worse. It's much more difficult. And there's so many more vulnerable people. I mean, that's, again, putting a weak spin, but there are a lot of people who, are, like I said, slashing and stuff when things get rough, like when there's a lot of repression and lockdowns and stuff. So you always end up taking that into account when you're close to everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Anyways, thank you very much. I hope I was somehow coherent.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for talking to me. If you missed the intro, that was a conversation with Ann Hansen about her recent memoir, Taking the Rap: Women Doing Time for Society's Crimes. And that book is available from the publisher, Between the Lines, at btlbooks.com. You've been listening to From Embers, a weekly show of anarchist ideas and practice across the territory most recently known as Canada. We broadcast every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario. You can also find the podcast edition at fromembers.libsyn.com, or you can find us using any major podcatching app on your phone. We're also a part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network, so check them out at channelzeronetwork.com for more interesting anarchist podcasts, if that's your thing. As always, we'd love to hear from you. Email us with questions, ideas, feedback, or projects you'd like to talk about at fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Join us for Kite Line, a weekly radio program on Channel Zero Network that focuses on issues in the prison system. With over 50 episodes already released, you can hear informative and riveting stories about the impact of prisons on people both inside and outside of the prison walls, and how they fight back.
Kite Line is intended as means of communication between people across prison walls. Our goal at Kite Line is to amplify the voices of those within the prison system while encouraging dialogue with those on the outside.
Hear us on the Channel Zero Network, and visit our website for more information or previous episodes at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
The Final Straw is a weekly anarchist radio show. It's fucking awesome, and you're never going to hear me say fucking awesome on our show because we're FCC regulated.
There's a black part of my heart that just flutters when you talk like that.
Talk, then more yelling.
It's a weird sort of like nice thing in a way, but also can get kind of crushing at times.
TheFinalStrawRadio.noblogs.org.